Brittany would. On the evening of May 30, 2012, 19-year-old Brittany would dressed up and left her mother's home in Mobile, Alabama, sometime between 7 and 7:30 p.m. Everyone assumed she was heading to visit a friend, but the truth was much darker. Unbeknownst to those around her, Brittany's real destination was her uncle, Donnie Holland's home. What began as a seemingly ordinary visit would soon spiral into a nightmarish ordeal for both her family and law enforcement. 2 days later, on June 1, 2012, the police made a chilling discovery. Donnie, Brittany's uncle, was found in his car, a gunshot wound to the back of his head revealing a chilling crime scene. The shocking and blood-stained scene added a layer of mystery. Intensifying further, Brittany would remain mysteriously absent. Did Brittany play a role in Donnie's death? And if so, what drove her to such actions? Or was it someone else who not only killed Donnie, but also kidnapped Brittany? Brittany always had a dream of becoming a hairdresser and opening her salon one day. However, the young girl just in her teenage years would come across a man named Andy Woods. Their connection blossomed, leading to the joyous arrival of their beautiful daughter, Peyton, in 2009 when Brittany was just 18. While initially relishing the freedom of youth, the birth of Peyton signaled a profound change in Brittany's life. However, her life took an even more significant turn when, just a few months after Peyton's birth, Annie and Brittany parted ways. Despite the breakup, the two made the decision to share custody, maintaining a positive and amicable relationship for the well-being of their daughter. Subsequently, Brittany ventured into dating, encountering several relationships that proved short-lived. Brittany found joy in spending time with her family, particularly her brother, Derek, whom she considered as her protector. Reflecting on her past, Brittany's tumultuous experiences were also rooted during her childhood days. Her father, Wallace Hankey, had divorced her mother, Chessie Wood, when she was just a baby. Despite the divorce, Brittany maintained a positive relationship with her father. However, the main complication arose in her connection with her uncle, Donnie Holland. Donnie seemed like a fun, loving guy to everyone, always nice to those around him. However, beneath the surface, his story was more complex than it appeared. At the time of his death, Donnie was actually under investigation for his alleged involvement in a child abuse ring, which extended to include other family members, even reaching members of Brittany's household. Now, is there a connection between everything that transpired in the past leading to the ultimate death of Donnie and Brittany's disappearance? On the evening of May 30, 2012, Brittany left her house around 7:30 p.m. with her family assuming she was visiting a friend. Despite attempts to contact her later that night, they couldn't reach Brittany. The family, accustomed to her spending days with her friends, didn't initially suspect anything was amiss. However, unbeknownst to them, this was not just one of those nights. As Brittany's whereabouts remain unknown, a chilling revelation awaited the family 2 days later. On June 1, 2012, Donnie Holland, Brittany's uncle, was found in his car with the engine still running, left in a secluded area overlooking the Fish River. He had a gunshot wound to the back of his head, behind his ear. He was transported to a local hospital but had passed away. Upon learning this distressing news, Brittany's family attempted once more to contact her and share the tragic information. Unfortunately, their attempts were in vain as her phone remained unresponsive, indicating that it was dead. When they were unable to locate Brittany at her usual hangouts, the family grew increasingly concerned. In response, they swiftly headed to the Mobile County Police Station and filed a missing person report. This set off a series of investigations encompassing both Donnie and Brittany. Now, at the crime scene, the police conducted an exhaustive search for any evidence that could swiftly solve the case. Their thorough sweep revealed a small gun and a phone battery inside the car. While at the hospital, Brittany's mother, Chessie, mentioned that bags had been placed on Donnie's hands, presumably later for testing for gunshot residue. However, it remains unclear why these bags were removed without undergoing testing. In addition to the investigation, the police interviewed Donnie's wife, Wendy Holland, and their friend, Jennifer Gonzalez Moore, the individuals who discovered Donnie's body. They reported that Donnie was still gurgling blood when found approximately a mile away from the main road. The specifics of the interrogation, including whether Donnie was alive or not and the reason for their search, remain undisclosed. However, there was a significant suspicion that Wendy might be somehow connected to this incident. The police gathered the phone battery and the gun, presuming it to be the weapon used to shoot Donnie. However, surprising turn of events occurred when Brittany's best friend, Tiffany Bailey, confirmed that the gun belonged to Brittany. Tiffany revealed that Brittany had purchased the gun for protection shortly before her disappearance. With suspicions running high, questions arose about whether Wendy and her friend were involved or if Brittany played a role. However, another perspective on this story was yet to be explored. At the time of his death, Donnie was under investigation for his alleged participation in a troubling child abuse ring that implicated several of his own family members. A mere 30 minutes before his scheduled meeting with the investigators to discuss these allegations, he succumbed to a fatal gunshot while seated in his vehicle. Eric Winberg, a former detective with the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office, posited the belief that Donnie likely anticipated arrest and, as a result, took his own life shortly before the planned police meeting. Amidst the suspicions and assumptions, the quest for truth began. The investigation was initiated by scrutinizing phone records. It was revealed that the battery found in Donnie's car belonged to Brittany's cell phone. Furthermore, the call records confirmed that Donnie and Brittany did, in fact, meet on May 30, 2012, the day she went missing. Records revealed that Donnie had picked up Brittany at her home in Mobile and drove her to the residence in the Styx River area. Brittany's text records revealed continuous messaging until 11:30 p.m., abruptly ceasing at that point. In the early hours of May 31st, they returned to Mobile, coinciding with the moment her phone ceased functioning, preventing any further data collection. Fueled by these revelations, the police force took drastic measures in their pursuit of Brittany. A widespread search ensued, mobilizing volunteers, the search and rescue unit, helicopters, dogs, and boats. The operation spanned a 5-mile radius around the Styx River Basin, the last location where Brittany's phone had pinged. Despite numerous interviews with her friends and family, the exhaustive efforts yielded no trace of her whereabouts. Meanwhile, Brittany's daughter also longed to see her mother. However, faced with the failed search for Brittany, the focus shifted back to Wendy. Police noted that on the day Donnie was discovered dead, Wendy was observed deleting items from Donnie's phone, suggesting an attempt to conceal something. Initially overlooked, this action gained significance as the investigation hit a dead end, prompting the police to turn their attention back to Wendy. The DNA results from the car yielded no conclusive evidence and the case reached a standstill. Soon, no further evidence surfaced to link anyone to the murder of Donnie Holland. Consequently, the case was closed, officially declaring it as a suicide. The decision to close the case as a suicide sparked controversy and raised many questions. Becca Johnson, a private investigator actively involved in the search for Brittany Wood, expressed skepticism, stating, "Generally, it's 4 to 5 hours till unpreserved gunshot residue is gone. And, hands and bags, it's being preserved. So I don't understand why that wasn't done, even if they thought it was an apparent suicide." Detective Eric Winberg confirmed that the gunshot residue test was not conducted because it was a procedure performed by the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences at that particular time. Firearms expert Cameron Busey pointed out that the brain matter and bone fragments would likely have embedded into Donnie's hands if he had shot himself. However, no test was conducted to determine this aspect as well. Moreover, Busey highlighted that placing the gun behind one's head would be highly unusual. "I don't know of any suicide that was done in that position." However, despite various concerns and observations, the cause of death was officially determined as suicide and no concrete evidence emerged to challenge this conclusion. Although the case of Donnie concluded unexpectedly, the investigation delved deeper into unraveling its complexities as they explored the possibility of a family member being involved in the crime. The investigations exposed a disturbing history that the family had been hiding for years. They found that Donnie Holland had a child abuse ring with the involvement of at least 11 other family members or friends. They had been abusing and exploiting children, including their own, for decades. As the police examined Brittany's Facebook profile, they discovered additional evidence linking the family to these accusations. Donnie's wife, Wendy, and Brittany's beloved brother, Derek, were among the 11 family members arrested for their involvement in the abuse ring. Adding to the gravity of the situation, Lee's mother, Chessie, faced charges of child abuse despite maintaining her innocence. The allegations against the mother included an assault on another underage female relative. As the inquiry progressed, information from Brittany's friends to whom she had confided surfaced. It was disclosed that Brittany herself had been a victim of Donnie's abuse when she was just 9 years old. According to her friends, Brittany had intentions of confronting Donnie and exposing him to the authorities. The revelation raised a significant question. Did Brittany kill Donnie out of revenge? While the hypothesis had a compelling backstory, the absence of concrete evidence made it purely speculative. In a simpler narrative or a motive, it might have been the audience's initial thought that Brittany was responsible for Donnie's death, considering the backstory and her subsequent disappearance, especially with her gun found. However, in legal procedures, evidence is paramount, and without sufficient proof, no further investigation into her involvement was pursued. Alongside the theory of Brittany seeking revenge, another hypothesis emerged. Could a past victim have killed Donnie out of revenge and subsequently kidnapped Brittany? The motive behind kidnapping Brittany remained unclear, but her unexplained disappearance prompted questions about whether she was still alive. While various hypotheses circulated, the undeniable fact was that Brittany's family was on the verge of facing the legal consequences. Nevertheless, Chessie, Brittany's mother, expressed frustration that her daughter had not been located yet. On December 9, 2014, a young victim testified against Donnie's wife, Wendy Holland, in court. The testimony included the harrowing account of the victim's earliest memories involving abuse by adult relatives, one of whom was the defendant, Wendy Holland, who was 35 at the time. During the largest case in Alabama, which involved the prosecution of 10 individuals, the teen girl testified that their relatives often engaged in adult group activities, mentioning that Brittany was sometimes involved in these activities. Prosecutor Teresa Hines asked how often such things occurred. "It happened a bunch," she replied. A man who later pleaded guilty testified that he once participated in a 6-way inappropriate encounter with a group of relatives, including the girl and Wendy Holland. Brittany Wood's 23-year-old brother Derek Wood pleaded guilty to engaging in inappropriate activities with the victim in Wendy Holland's case. He mentioned that he had such inappropriate interactions with Wendy too many times to count, starting at around the age of 13. Derek received youthful offender status for his case, which was sealed, and he spent 3 years incarcerated. Brittany's mother, Chessie Wood, who also faced charges related to a child abuse crime, arrived at court with her son, but was not allowed inside as she is a defendant in a related case. Moreover, she directly stated that her family members were guilty. Wendy Holland's brother-in-law, Dustin Kent, testified that he took part in a 6-way inappropriate encounter involving Wendy, the alleged teen victim, and his wife, Mindy Kent, who is Wendy Holland's twin sister. Dustin Kent, who also pleaded guilty to sex charges, stated he first witnessed Wendy Holland engaging in inappropriate activities with the alleged victim in October 2011. A week after entering a guilty plea, Dustin Kent pleaded guilty again in Mobile County, this time for charges of sodomy and assault related to engaging in inappropriate activities with 2 different 13-year-old family members in Toussaint. He was sentenced to 17 years in prison. Subsequently, Randall Scott Wood, another uncle of Brittany, entered a guilty plea in Mobile County. In succession, each of the accused individuals was convicted on charges related to child abuse. Mindy Kent, Wendy's identical twin sister, also landed behind bars after Mobile County jurors convicted her of sodomy and abuse of a child under the age of 12 in 2015. She was sentenced to a maximum sentence of 40 years behind bars, 20 years for each count against her. In 2015, Wendy Holland was convicted of child abuse and child torture, receiving a staggering sentence of 19 years in prison. Brittany's mother, Chessie Wood, also admitted guilt to a misdemeanor charge and child endangerment. The conclusion of Donnie Holland's death as a suicide continues to be shrouded in controversy. The significant question of whether Brittany was the perpetrator remains unanswered definitively. However, one truth remains clear amidst the darkness. The troubled family of Brittany would ultimately face the consequences they deserved. After hiding their secretive actions for so long, justice eventually prevailed. But when it comes to the night of the murder or Brittany's disappearance, only one person knows what truly happened. Brittany Wood herself. More than a decade has passed, and her whereabouts remain a mystery. What are your thoughts on this disturbing case? What could have happened the night of Donnie's death? Was it really a disappearance and a suicide, or is there something even more twisted at play? We'd love to hear your opinions. Feel free to share your thoughts with us. Camp Scott. In the summer of 1977, as camp season was gearing up for children across the United States, Camp Scott in northeastern Oklahoma was preparing for another season of fun and adventure. Located in Mayes County, the camp had been a retreat for Girl Scouts since 1928. The 410-acre site nestled in the woods could accommodate 140 campers and up to 30 staff members. The camp was divided into 10 camping units, all connected by a road known as Cookie Trail, which meandered through the lush forest. However, just 2 months before the camp season was to begin, a troubling discovery occurred. In April of 1977, during a group training session, a summer camp counselor found that someone had broken into her cabin. The unknown intruder had gone through her personal belongings, raising concerns about the security of the camp. Strangely enough, the only thing missing was all of her donuts out of their box. In their place was a hastily scrawled note that read, in part, "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in Tent 1. A fake body was also found hanging on the property. This incident and the accompanying note was disregarded as the message also made mention of Martians, and therefore the whole affair was seen as a prank. The management at Camp Scott made a decision many later called foolish when they failed to disclose the so-called prank to parents of the children slated to attend the upcoming summer sessions. Tent 1 stayed within the tent rotation and was assigned per the usual procedures. On Sunday, June 12, 1977, 3 young girls, Lori Lee Farmer, age 8, Michelle Heather Goose, age 9, and Doris Denise Milner, nicknamed Denise, age 10, bounded joyfully onto the bus that would take them along with 137 other campers to Camp Scott. The large group of preteen campers were set to spend a fun and eventful 2 weeks at the camp, but for 3 random girls, their trip would be tragically cut short. Upon arrival, the girls were all assigned campsites and tents. The camp was split into 10 different units, within which there were around 7 tents for campers, as well as a counselor's tent. Each campsite had a Native American tribe's name, and Lori, Denise, and Michelle were assigned to the Kiowa campsite, Tent 8. There were 27 Girl Scouts in Kiowa unit, and they were split into 7 different tents. Tent number 8 was located on the edge of the campsite, and geographically the farthest from the camp counselor's tent, which was some 150 yards away and hidden behind the forest's massive trees and foliage. The trio was actually supposed to be a quartet, as a 4th girl was also set to be in Tent 8 that night, but due to a clerical error, she had been misassigned. The unnamed 4th girl was meant to be moved to Tent 8 that very evening, but due to an impending thunderstorm, the camp counselors decided to postpone the move, thus unknowingly saving that girl's life. At 7 p.m. the night of June 12, the storm was in full force, but the girls were warm and happy, acquainting themselves over dinner in the dining tent. After eating, they, along with the rest of the brood, walked to their tents to retire for the night. That evening, after returning to their tent from dinner, the girls wrote letters to their families at home. 9-year-old Michelle writes, "Dear Aunt Karen, how are you? I am fine. I am writing from camp that we can't go outside because it is storming. Me and my tent mates are in the last tent in our unit. My tent mates are Denise Milner and Lori Farmer. My room is shades of purple. Love." Lori writes to her family in part, "We're just getting ready to go to bed. It is 7:45, I couldn't wait to write. We're all writing letters now because there's nothing else to do. But it is perhaps Denise's letter that seems the most haunting, as she was already uneasy about her impending 2-week stay. Don't like camp. It's awful," she writes. "Mom, I don't want to stay at camp for 2 weeks. I want to come home and see Cassie and everybody." These letters would be the last written words of these precious and innocent girls. Carla Wilhite, a university student working at the camp, later testified that around 1:30 a.m. in the early morning of June 13th, she heard what she described as guttural moaning sounds at a cross-section of trails leading towards the showers. She swept her flashlight across the campsite as the noise started up again, but seeing nothing out of the usual, returned to her tent without alerting anybody else. She later explained that she assumed it was an animal and made the choice not to tell her coworkers because she thought they would be annoyed at having to walk through the cold, damp, dark forest and would think she was not up to the job of being a camp counselor. This choice, she says, would haunt her for the rest of her life. Others at the campsite that night later reported seeing a flashlight bobbing through the woods and also recalled hearing moaning or groaning sounds. At around 2 a.m., a girl in Tent 7 recalls the tent flap opening and a figure with a flashlight standing in the entryway. The girl was one of 4 campers in that tent and the only one awake at the time. She watched silently as the figure regarded the group for a second before closing the tent flap and walking off. The camper was confused and simply went back to sleep without alerting anyone. Between 2:30 and 3 a.m., a nearby landowner later reported hearing a great deal of automobile traffic on his remote road near the camp. At 3 a.m., a girl in a neighboring campsite, the Cherokee camp, heard a scream. She recalls looking at her watch and waking up another girl. They listened for more noises and upon hearing none, went back to sleep. At roughly the same time, another girl from another campsite says she heard screams and someone crying, "Mama, Mama." She, unsure of what to do, did nothing and went back to sleep. At 6 a.m. the next morning, Carla Wilhite, the same camp counselor who had heard the strange sounds in the night, was jogging the path towards the same cross-section of trails that led to the camp showers, which was the same location of the strange noises she had heard the night before. Under some trees, she spotted 3 sleeping bags. Thinking it was leftover luggage from the new campers dropped off the day prior, she began to make her way towards it. Then she saw a body. It was the 10-year-old body of Doris Denise Milner. Carlos' screams first alerted the other camp counselors to the gruesome scene, and quickly a crowd gathered. Upon seeing Denise, dead, beaten, bound, and partially nude, the counselors were too fearful to open the other 2 closed sleeping bags, and police didn't even realize that there were 3 victims until authorities arrived on scene and a coroner opened the 2 zipped sleeping bags. Authorities would testify that the other 2 girls, Lori and Michelle, were both bound with elastic bands in their respective sleeping bags, both in fetal positions and wrapped in bloodied bedsheets. Both girls had died of blunt force trauma to the backs of their heads, seemingly while they were still sleeping inside the tent. Denise, however, detectives surmised, had been led away from the tent still alive. Evidence showed Denise was sexually assaulted and beaten so hard in the face that indentations of the weapon remained as post-mortem artifacts, although her cause of death is listed as strangulation. There was blood on the floor of the tent, indicating the girls had initially been attacked inside and then were carried outside. Evidence found on scene included a large flashlight, red in color, with a single fingerprint on the lens that, while able to be dusted, imaged, and scanned, never returned any matches in any state or federal databases. A footprint left in the pool of blood in the tent was also found, made by a male-size 9.5 shoe. Along with these items, there was also a rope, duct tape, and a long black hair. Authorities began their tedious and emotionally charged investigations surrounding the camp with emergency vehicles. Parents were informed that something had gone wrong, and that they would have to pick up their children at the council building. Parents of all 140 campers rightfully panicked and drove to the camp, creating a literal mile-long line of cars backing up into the entrance road known as Cookie Trail, so named for the Girl Scouts' most famous annual endeavor. Frantic parents were turned away and forced to wait hours in the sun as the camp was put on lockdown. Terrified parents who saw the emergency vehicles and heard rumors were not told of their camper status. The rest of the Girl Scouts themselves were not told that 3 of their campmates were dead. They were taken to participate in activities away from the campsite until the buses arrived to take them back to the Magic Empire Council in Tulsa. The camp was eventually evacuated entirely and campers were released to their parents or guardians, with some being released without even their luggage and all of them confused at the purpose of their trip being cut so short. June 13th would be the last day Camp Scott ever operated. The camp would close for good. The investigation went into full swing once the camp was cleared out. The following day, June 14th, detectives noted that it appeared the murderer had attempted to clean up the blood and smeared it around in the process. There was blood not only on floor, but also on the towels and mattresses. The investigators soon learned about Jack Schroff, who owned a ranch near Camp Scott. At his home, black duct tape was found as well as rope, which appeared identical to that which had been used to bind the wrists of two of the girls. However, Schroff claimed that his house had been broken into prior to the attack. Some items had been stolen from his cabin, but he could not name exactly what had been taken. Schroff took a polygraph and passed that he also had a solid alibi for the night of the murders and therefore was cleared as a suspect. Authorities then came up with a new suspect named Gene Leroy Hart. Gene Leroy Hart was a local Cherokee man, raised just 1 mile from Camp Scott. He had been at large for 4 years since 1973 when he escaped the Mays County Jail, out of which he was an inmate for the crime of kidnapping and the subsequent rape of 2 pregnant women as well as 4 counts of burglary. Although there is no direct evidence linking Hart to the crime, the sheriff in town, Weaver, said that he believed Hart was 1,000% guilty, but he did not elaborate as to why he believed that. Several days after the murders, some hunters discovered a cave which appeared inhabited. They found a number of items in the cave, including women's glasses, pages from the Tulsa newspaper, a section of which had been found in the battery compartment of the flashlight, possibly to keep the batteries from rattling around, and photographs that Hart himself had developed while working in the photo lab at the Granite Reformatory. Perhaps the most tantalizing clue found in the cave was a note written on the wall which read, 77617, "The real killer was here. Bye-bye, fools." Nearly 1 year after the crime, Hart was picked up at the home of a Cherokee man by the name of Pigeon and arrested on suspicion of the brutal assault and murders. Investigators searched the residence of Pigeon, but did not find anything related to the case. They searched again, and this time they found items that the camp counselor claimed had gone missing before camp began. Pigeon claimed these items were never there and that they had been planted in his home. There was also speculation that Sheriff Weaver actually had the photos which belonged to Hart in his desk at the Mays County Jail and planted them in the cave, therefore tying Hart to the case. Many family and area residents believed Hart was innocent. They raised money for his defense and supported him during his trial. A key piece of evidence was the long black hair which was found on one of the victims. A state crime analyst said that although the hair matched Hart's hair, you could not identify a person based on hair alone at that time in 1977. The fingerprint on the flashlight lens did not match that of Hart. The bloody footprint in the tent was also too small to be Hart's. A jury eventually found Hart acquitted of all charges, and when they pronounced that verdict, Hart began openly sobbing with relief. He maintained his innocence. The not guilty verdict notwithstanding, Hart still had a 306-year state prison sentence for the crimes he was originally convicted of, as well as the successful prison escape. However, after just 2 months back in jail, Hart had a massive heart attack and died instantly at age 35. The parents of Doris Denise and Lori Farmer, but not those of Michelle, sued the Magic Empire Council of Girl Scouts for $5 million, alleging that the organization's administrators and the adults in charge were negligent. They included complaints regarding the threatening note left in the donut box 2 months prior to the tragedy, as well as the lack of adequate supervision of the campers and lack of follow-up in regards to the noises made that night. One of the campers who heard sounds in the night, though it is unclear which camper, says she told the camp counselor of these screams and was told to ignore them. In their defense, the camp counselors explained that the first nights at Camp Scott are typically filled with the excitement of girls meeting each other, with much laughter and chatter. However, in 2008, bodily fluids found inside one of the tents were sent for DNA testing using more advanced forensic technology. Unfortunately, the samples were too degraded for meaningful results, offering no new leads in the case. Despite extensive investigation, no viable suspects have emerged and the case remains open and unsolved to this day. Larry Groves. Around 11 p.m. on January 12, 2003, 40-year-old Larry Groves, who lived alone with his 2 dogs, was on the phone with his friend Sandy Smith from Mississippi. Just 10 minutes into their nightly chat, someone began banging on Larry's door, accompanied by an angry man's voice demanding to be let in. Concerned, Sandy asked Larry who it was. Larry said he would handle it and call her back in 20 minutes. But Larry never called back and he was never heard from again. On January 28, Larry's mother Wanda filed a missing report on her son. She found out that nobody had heard from Larry in weeks and that he had also not been attending to his successful antique business. Upon entering his house, authorities found no trace of the 40-year-old or his 2 dogs. The house was immaculate with nothing taken nor out of place. This was confirmed by his mother, who went on to search the house for clues on Memorial Day weekend in May, and by his sister Pam Spence, who also looked for details police might have overlooked in her brother's house that April. Then on June 18, roughly 5 months after Larry was last heard from his neighbor, a man named Dick Shelley, all noticed that the peach tree in Larry's garden was starting to come far over the fence, which separated their properties. The ripened fruit that fell to the ground was attracting bees that started to attack Shelley's dog every time he let it outside. Mildly annoyed by this, he began cutting back the branches which hung over the fence. It was at this point that Shelley noticed something disturbing. Great big bullflies covered the inside of a window in Larry's house. The exterior siding looked as though it had been painted black. He realized now that the crows that frequently gathered on the fence had been feasting on these bugs. Uncomfortable with what he was seeing, Shelley immediately called Earl Bennett, the owner of the property. Earl was the father of Larry's partner, Tom, who had passed away from a heart attack in 2C1. The two had been living together in the home since Larry was 17, after Earl had given the property to his son. Once Tom had passed away, however, ownership reverted back to Earl, who told Larry that he could continue to live in the bungalow for as long as he wanted. Inside, Shay and Bennett were hit with a foul odor. They thought it must have been the rotting meat in the fridge, but it wasn't. Earl and Bennett realized it was perhaps coming from the crawl space. Together, the men moved Larry's desk and pulled back the rug, revealing the trap door to the crawl space where they found the badly decomposed body of Larry Groves. His body had disintegrated so badly in the summer heat that a cause of death could not be determined. Larry's family, Wanda Groves and Pam Spence, were sickened by the news, realizing they had both been right next to Larry when they'd been searching the home for clues. After speaking further with friends and family, Indiana State Police managed to discover the name of their first and only suspect in the case, the man who had turned up at the door on January 12, 2003. On June 18, that same year, on the same day the body was found, police took this man in for questioning. Detective Don Curl, who worked on the case, described the suspect, who has never been publicly named, as being cold and calculated, never losing composure or rising to the bait. The interview ended with the suspect staying silent until his lawyer arrived after telling police that he had already revealed everything he knew. An article from 2007 stated that police hadn't spoken with the man since this initial interview. In November of 2006, the FBI crime lab in Phoenix established that the hair and blood samples taken from Larry's body in crawlspace did not conclusively match the man suspected of the murder. Although 1 year later, Don Curl said there might be more evidence to test. In the months after Larry's initial disappearance, his other next-door neighbor, Fred Holdman, claimed to have seen trucks coming and going at the home. However, he didn't think anything of it since Larry himself often drove a truck and loaded it up with antiques. So it was a common scene on the street. Law enforcement discovered from this information that the suspects they later questioned used the 40-year-old's truck to load up antiques and sell them to Michigan-based dealers. In the years following Larry's death, police seemed no closer to arresting his killer. To friends and family, it seemed obvious who was responsible, yet justice was out of reach. Larry was described by those who knew him as, quote, someone you either liked or you didn't, due to his frank nature and no-nonsense approach, but also as someone who was dependable and who would do anything for anyone. His partner, Tom Bennett, was about 10 years his senior and had taught Larry everything he knew about antiques. According to his friend, Sandy Smith, the couple had trouble being accepted in their town of Lakeville, Indiana. Larry was more effeminate and less confrontational than his partner, and so he took the brunt of the harassment. These statements from Sandy have made some online sleuths consider if Larry was the target of a hate crime. It has also been noted whoever killed Larry had to have known there was a crawl space beneath the house, something which even his mother and sister didn't seem to know existed. This line of speculation has led to some questioning the geniusness of Earl Bennett's character. It was clear he knew the trapdoor was there. So why did he not say anything sooner? Another theory that has been discussed online is the idea that the suspect had perhaps brought some muscle with him, another person to do the dirty work. It's possible this person ambushed Larry when he opened the door, and maybe this would explain why the DNA found on the body did not match the police's primary suspects. Many have also questioned what happened to the dogs Larry owned, as they were never located. Dean Rauch, a reporter at the Lunar Echo newspaper in Lakeville, heavily criticized the local community for not caring about Larry's case or finding his killer, blaming this on homophobia. He remarked, "There is no real public outrage. If this were an elderly woman or someone's grandmother, people would be up in arms about this murder. If it were an 11-year-old girl, there would still be yellow ribbons everywhere, but generally no one cares. I think that's sad." Nearly 20 years later, Larry Grove's murder remains unsolved. Margaret and Shauna Tapp. The double murder of Margaret Christine Tapp and her daughter Shauna Lee Tapp is one of Australia's most infamous unsolved crimes. On August 7, 1984, the family lived in Ferntree Gully, Melbourne, Victoria, when an unknown assailant broke into their home and savagely killed them. Margaret, a 35-year-old nurse and law student, was beaten and strangled with the length of rope, while her 9-year-old daughter, Shauna, was sexually assaulted and then strangled. The two were discovered the following day, with Shauna's lifeless body found on her bed. The afternoon of August 8, the boyfriend of Margaret's sister came for a visit as he was passing through the neighborhood. He picked up their newspaper and approached the door. While he knocked, he noticed that Margaret's car was there, so was surprised when no one seemed to come to the door. It wasn't until later in the day, around 6 p.m., when Margaret's date for the night, Jim, came to pick her up, that the bodies were discovered. Jim entered through the back door, which had a faulty lock, when no one answered at the front of the house. Aghast at the scene he found inside, he went next door to the home of their neighbors and called for the emergency services. Upon first glance, investigators thought that the scene looked like that of a domestic violence case. Jim. Margaret's date was prime suspect number 1, since he was the one who discovered the bodies. And while he was interrogated, his story was found to be sound. He was also later cleared via DNA evidence. Margaret's ex-husband was another obvious suspect, but he had a solid alibi for the night of the murder and was dismissed also. A neighbor reported to authorities that she'd heard muffled screams from the house around 11 p.m., and the people who lived across the road noticed that the Tapp's normally quiet spaniel barked and howled around midnight. This at least gave investigators some sort of time frame to work with. But after interviewing Margaret's date and ex-husband, the case trail began to grow cold. Given Margaret's busy social and love life, it seemed that there were just too many different leads to follow, which made it hard for police to prioritize and work them. Not only this, but authorities found little in the way of forensic evidence. They gathered DNA evidence from Shauna's nightgown, but found no unknown fingerprints in the house. Dunlop Valley tennis shoe prints were found in Margaret's bedroom and the bathroom. This lack of evidence is perhaps what slowed the case the most, as authorities are widely criticized for their slow progress on the case. It took over 20 years for Margaret's own brother to be ruled out as a suspect, as well as a former colleague of his who is described as a violent man with a record and who once delivered furniture to Margaret's home. A notoriously troublesome family on the street are yet to be cleared. Margaret hired one of the children, a teenage son, to mow her lawn and wash her car, which caused neighbors to warn her off speaking to him, as he had made sexually suggestive remarks to other women. More disturbingly, the sister of this young man lived in a caravan beside the house with her boyfriend, who was later jailed for rape. Margaret had also been taking driving lessons around the time of her murder, and her instructor, who had an interest in her, had given her free lessons so he could continue seeing her. Police found his prints in her house, but when questioned about it, he denied ever having been in the home. One suspect in the case of Margaret and Sean's murders was a former senior policeman, Ian Cook, now retired, who knew Margaret's dad and was a friend of the family's. He seemed to be quickly dismissed from the investigation, but Margaret's sister brought up his name the very day the bodies were found. A few days prior, he'd been visiting and brought gifts with him. Cook had allegedly tried to get Margaret to sleep with him, and she was irritated by his unwanted attention. A search of his car turned up a whip and a length of rope, but it seems that no further progress came from this lead. Friends of Margaret's offered up some of the most compelling information when it came to suspects. They claimed she had relationships with 4 or more doctors at the hospital she worked in, plus maintained a long-term rocky affair with a married doctor who died in a car crash before the murder. According to the Herald Sun, Margaret's home was provided for her by this same doctor. His wife reportedly knew of the affair, and Margaret had even come to their doorstep once to beg the doctor to leave his wife and come and live with her. The confrontations between the two continued for a time after the death of the doctor. As Margaret tried to secure the house, he had left her in court, eventually being granted half of the property. After the murders, Margaret's family purchased the other half of the home. A fellow nurse from the hospital where Margaret worked suggested that a spurned lover might have been responsible for the killings, citing Margaret's tendency to ridicule men and claiming she could chop them up into little pieces. It was discovered that a married man Margaret had been studying with had lunch with her the Tuesday before her death, and a Ford utility vehicle was seen parked near the house shortly before the murders, though the owner was never identified. In 2008, the prosecution of a suspect in the case collapsed when it was revealed that the evidence against him had been contaminated. In 2017, a reward of $1 million Australian dollars, approximately $700,000, was offered for information leading to the conviction of the killer. Despite numerous leads, the heartbreaking double homicide of Margaret Tapp and her 9-year-old daughter remains unsolved. Philip Kahn, an unidentified man's bones were discovered on July 24, 2000, close to Grand Monon Banks, 27 miles off the coast of Maine. DNA samples and fingerprints were collected. The FBI received the fingerprints, but they turned up no matches. The FBI's combined DNA index received the uploaded sample, yet there was no match. The case was unsolved for several years when no clues were discovered. In 2019, the Office of Chief Medical Examiner contacted Parabon Nanolabs to analyze the DNA and attempt forensic genealogy. Parabon analyzed a DNA sample and learned that the man was Jewish, but still did not know who he was. However, in March of 2022, the FBI's Criminal Justice Information Services and Deceased Persons Identification Services Division got involved. The unidentified person's fingerprints were then submitted in May of 2022. On January 11, 2023, it was announced that the remains found belonged to 84-year-old Philip Kahn. The FBI was able to match the fingerprints and dental records to Philip, who had been reported missing in Las Vegas in the year 2000. That his next of kin has been notified of the identification. Philip left Las Vegas, Nevada, and landed in New York City in July of 2000. It remains unknown why or how he ended up off the coast of Maine. Moving on to the next case. The Dardeen family murders. On November 18, 1987, 29-year-old Russell Keith Dardeen, a treatment plant operator at a lakewater facility, failed to show up for his shift. Known for being a reliable worker, his colleagues and boss grew worried when he didn't even call in sick to inform them. Keith's supervisor reached out to both of his divorced parents, but neither had seen or heard from him. Keith's father then arranged to meet with local police to investigate the mobile home where Keith and his family lived. Neither expected to find the truly horrific scene that awaited them. Inside the home were the bodies of Keith's wife, Ruby Elaine Dardeen, their 2-year-old son, Peter, and their previously unborn daughter, Casey. All three were tucked up into the same bed. Elaine had been bound and gagged with duct tape, and she and Peter had been beaten to death with a baseball bat found at the scene. The bat was a birthday gift from Keith to his son. It seemed that Ruby Elaine Dardeen, who had been heavily pregnant at the time, had been beaten so badly that she'd gone into labor, delivering a baby girl who was also subsequently murdered like her mother and brother. It was noticed quickly that Keith was not in the home and that his red 1981 Plymouth car was missing too. Investigators assumed that he had some sort of mental break and was responsible for the horrific slaughter of his family, but his body was found by hunters the following day in a field near the trailer. He'd been shot 3 times and sexually mutilated. The Plymouth was found parked outside the police station at Benton, 11 miles from the home. The interior was splattered with blood. Local police and Illinois state cops worked together on the investigation with 30 detectives assigned to work the case full-time. 100 people were interviewed and a man who was taken into custody early on was soon released. Although there is little information as to why he was brought in. Another coworker who'd had a disagreement with Keith was interviewed but dismissed as a suspect. Neither Elaine nor her husband Keith had any alcohol or drugs in their system. A small quantity of marijuana was found in the trailer, but not in sufficient quantity to imply that the couple were dealing drugs. and the police suspected it was possibly inadvertently dropped by the killer. The time of death served to muddy the waters of the case further, as each member was killed within an hour of the other. Elaine, Peter, and Casey had been dead for 12 hours before they were found, whilst Keith had been dead for 24 to 36 hours by the time he was found. Authorities couldn't determine how the murders were carried out, but it was speculated that since the killer had time to tidy up the crime scene and took 3 family members in bed, they mustn't have been in a rush to leave, which led to the idea that perhaps Keith was killed first. As there was no evidence of forced entry, police wondered if the family had been killed by someone they knew. Keith's mother, Joanne, said the increasing crime rates in the area had led to Keith and Elaine putting their mobile home up for sale so they could move somewhere that felt safer, and that Keith especially had become increasingly protective of the family. When a young woman came to the door to ask to use their phone, he refused to let her in. This makes it seem possible that someone the family knew had come to the door and committed the crimes. No valuables were missing from the home and no sexual assaults had taken place, which prompted police to speculate about what could possibly be the motive behind the crime. The Franklin County coroner gave his tour cue by adding that he felt the crime was motivated by personal reasons and was not a random act of brutal violence. Elaine worked at an office supply store and she and her husband partook in a musical ensemble with a small Baptist church in their free time. There was no evidence of extramarital affairs by either party. By all accounts, they were a happy, well-liked family. Still, given the sexual mutilation and whispers that Elaine's child had been ripped from the womb, drove conspiratorial speculations that the culprits were Satanists active in the area, performing a ritual sacrifice of the family. Police experts on cults disputed this theory by pointing out that there was very little mutilation, no body parts were harvested, and there was a lack of symbolism and lit candles at the scene, which are things common in ritualistic killings. FBI profilers found that the crime scene defied their usual analytical methods and could provide little in the way of new insights and leads. Joanne, Keith's mother, has been a huge advocate for finding answers in the case. She theorizes that the family were possibly murdered in a case of mistaken identity, or maybe someone tried to force her son into doing something illegal, such as selling drugs, and he was killed for refusing. She also speculates that maybe Elaine rejected someone's advances and was murdered in revenge. Joanne works tirelessly on finding new leads, reporting anything she finds to the lone officer still working the case and asking constantly if there's any new movement in it. America's Most Wanted ran a segment on the story in 1988, but the Oprah Winfrey Show declined to run the story on the basis that it was too gruesome for daytime TV. After this point, theories begin to peter out. Angel Resendez was considered a suspect at one point in time, but no connection was ever made between him and the murder of the Dardens. Resendez was a particularly violent serial killer who traveled the country by train, chose victims near the tracks, and beat them to death sometime in the year 2000 or shortly after serial killer Tommy Sells awaiting trial for murder admitted to other crimes, including the needless deaths of the Dardens. However, many find Sells' alleged confession hard to believe for a number of reasons, including that he changed his story numerous times. He first claimed to have met Keith at a truck stop or pool hall. He gave different variations. And after being invited to the Dardens' home for dinner, Sells' anger was triggered by Keith sexually propositioning him. In one version, he says Keith asked him to participate in a threesome with Elaine. Sells then said he forced Keith by gunpoint to drive to the area he was killed in, and then he returned home to murder the rest of the family. In the third version of events as told by Sells, he didn't meet Keith at all, but decided upon seeing the for sale sign outside the Dardeen home, to knock on the door of the home and pretend to be a buyer. He overpowered Keith and forced him to gag and bind the rest of the family. He then forced the 29-year-old to the area he was killed in and returned to the family home. He claimed to have raped Elaine before killing her and her children. But there are several discrepancies in this last story, starting with the fact that Elaine was not sexually assaulted. It's important to note that the Dardeen family was so wary of crime that they wouldn't even allow a young woman into their home. So the question remains, how did they open their door to someone like Tommy Sells? Sells was also unreliable when it came to providing information that hadn't been made public, often giving incorrect answers until he eventually guessed the right one. Friends and family find it hard to believe his claims about Keith making advances, as Keith had never shown any interest in other men. Authorities suspect that Sells may have confessed in hopes of gaining favor with the judicial system, possibly seeking a more lenient sentence. However, the tragic case of the Dardine family remains unsolved to this day. Moving on to the next case. The Setagaya family murders. The Setagaya family murders, which took place in Setagaya, Tokyo, are among the most puzzling and notorious crimes in recent years. Despite being the focus of one of Japan's largest investigations with a wealth of clues and very specific details about the murderer uncovered, no one has ever been charged for the brutal slaying of the Miyazawa family. Mikio Miyazawa, 44, worked for a London-based consulting firm, while his wife, 41-year-old Yasuko, was a schoolteacher. Together they had 2 children, 8-year-old Nina and 6-year-old Rei, and lived in a quiet, mostly deserted neighborhood near a skate park, with only 2 or 3 other families in the area. According to witnesses, days before the murder of the family, Mikio was seen arguing with a skateboarder from the nearby busy skate park while another saw him arguing with a biker gang, although details on this are hazy at best. It was also reported that a car was repeatedly parked outside the house of the Miyazawa family. And on the night of the killings around 11:35 p.m., a man was seen hurrying away on a path near the home. It was possibly the killer leaving, although this cannot be said for certain. On the night of December 30, 2000, around 10:38 to 10:45, the family computer received an email that required a password to open. This is the last time that the family were known to be alive. The next day, Yasuko's mother, who lived next door with several other family members, called the family only to be met with silence. Concerned, she went to the house of her daughter only to find no one came to the door, which was locked from the inside. Using her own key, Yasuko's mother let herself in only to stumble upon a terrifying scene. 6-year-old Rei had been strangled whilst asleep in his bunk bed, while Yasuko, Nina, and Mikio had all been stabbed to death. Strangely, the females in the family had been attacked more savagely long after their death, suggesting to investigators that perhaps this person had a hatred for women. The investigation into the deaths of the Miyazawa family was one of the biggest to be undertaken in Japanese history. Over 246,000 investigators have worked the case and 12,845 pieces of evidence have been taken and analyzed. Investigators found that the phone lines in the house had been cut and that the second-floor bathroom window was open, leading to speculation that this was how the culprit entered. That it's theorized that Rei was killed first and that Michio heard some sort of noise upstairs while working in his office and went to investigate when he ran into the killer at the top of the stairs. His body was found at the bottom of them. Yasuko and Nina were found at the foot of the ladder leading to the third-floor loft, and it's believed that they'd likely gone to hide when the killer went for a second knife after damaging his first when he killed Michio. The most bizarre aspect of the murder of the Japanese foursome that it seems that the killer hung around the house for hours afterwards. He used the family computer, ate ice cream, drank barley tea, and napped on the couch. He even used the toilet as investigators were able to collect and analyze feces found, which showed that the day before, he had eaten string beans and sesame seeds. The killer also left behind clothing items and the murder weapons. Only 130 units of the sweater he wore were made and sold, but authorities only tracked down 12 buyers. Most of the brands he wore were from skateboarding stores, and his shoes appeared to be labeled with a Korean size rather than Japanese. The clothing left indicated that the killer was a 170 centimeters and of a thin build. A hip bag belonging to the killer was found too, and sand inside it was found to be from the Edwards Air Force Base in California. There also appeared to be some sand from a Japanese skate park, although there's no true clarification on whether it's from a specific skate park or not. Some articles also state that grip tape for the surface of skateboards was found inside. 6 hours after the crime was discovered, a 30-something-year-old man was treated for a deep hand wound at the local hospital. A first aid kit had been found in the house with bandages found in the kitchen and living room. Some of the bandages had blood on, and it was established that some belonged to Nina and some belonged to the killer. The man in the hospital didn't give a name or reason for his wound and was simply treated and discharged. Many have speculated that this man was the killer. It also seemed that some money was missing from the Miyazawa family home. A quantity valued at approximately $1,250, but investigators found money lying about that hadn't been taken. So it was ruled out that robbery was a motive, especially as no other valuables had been stolen. Also gone from the house was an old jacket of Mikio's, and the computer power cord could not be located. Some reports initially claimed that New Year's Eve greeting cards were missing from the Miyazawa home, but this was later proven to be false. It turned out that an officer had taken them into evidence to follow up with the family and friends who had sent them. According to Yasuko's mother, loud bang was heard around 11:30 p.m., possibly caused by Mikio falling down the stairs or the soft ladder deploying. In 2017, DNA analysis revealed that traces of blood type A found at the scene, which did not belong to the family, suggested the killer's mother might be of European descent, possibly from a country near the Mediterranean or the Adriatic Sea. The Y chromosome analysis indicated that the father was of Asian descent. Every year, the Tokyo Metropolitan Police visit the house for memorial ceremonies. Despite the vast amount of information and the extensive investigation that was carried out, the murders of the Miyazawa family remain unsolved. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with us. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to NA Cold Cases for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries. Your support helps us bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like us to cover next. See you in the next video, and remember, the search for truth never stops. Barbara Bullock, 55-year-old Barbara Bullock, has a passion for hiking. Before her spouse had a heart attack and stopped hiking, the two of them went on hikes together. Then Barbara made the decision to go hiking with a few of her pals. On July 18, 2007, she went hiking in the Bitterroot Mountains with a family friend named Jim Ramaker. Jim claimed to have glanced at a vista for a brief while during the trek. He turned back to Barbara, but she was gone from view. She was, according to Jim, 20 to 30 feet behind him. In addition, he says that during their hiking excursion, Barbara and he had conversations with two young males, but those men have never come forward. One of them had medium-toned skin and reddish-brown hair, while the other had dark skin and hair. This is the possible appearance of a man with black hair. It's possible that they were operating an older, light-colored Chevrolet SUV with Montana license plates. The two men appeared to be in their early 20s, and a black mixed-breed dog with white markings was with them. These two men are wanted by the police to talk to because they might have important information, not because they are suspects. Jim was clearly the primary suspect. Had it been him, he undoubtedly could have devised a more captivating narrative than Barbara's abrupt disappearance. Jim might have heard her fall, but he chose not to listen. However, by now wouldn't she have been located? While it is implausible, others claim that Barbara left on her own initiative. Why had she brought someone along in the first place if her goal was to flee? It seems much more plausible than someone. Possibly those two young men who never came forward took her. Bonnie Baker. In 1998, Bonnie Baker, then 47 years old, resided in Denver, Colorado. Her boyfriend, Crispin Nene Perez, hosted her during her stay. Bonnie was employed at a Morrison, Colorado Ford restaurant. Bonnie and Crispin rejoiced when Bonnie got a pay raise during a party they went to with friends in June 1998. Crispin became enraged during the evening when Bonnie danced with other people together. The couple exited the party. In her final words to one of her friends, Bonnie said, "It would be worse if I didn't go now." Someone reported to 911 that same evening that a woman had been murdered in her West Louisiana Avenue apartment. The caller claimed that Crispin Nene Perez was the guilty party and that he was transporting the woman's body to Mexico in a trunk with plans to dispose of it somewhere along the route. The detectives arrived at the flat that Bonnie and Crispin occupied. The kitchen table was flipped over and there were shattered glasses and dishes all over the floor. The neighbor who dialed 911 believed that she had been gripped by detectives at the site telling her, "I'm going to make Bonnie disappear so you won't have to see her ever again." Investigators thought they knew exactly what had transpired. After they got into a fight, Crest resolved to kill Bonnie inside their apartment. The neighbor reported that when he placed her body in the trunk of his car, he drove off to Mexico. Efforts by investigators to locate Crespin or Bonnie were unsuccessful. Crespin's car was described by the neighbor. An automobile with the same license plate and description crashed close to Globe, Arizona, 2 days later. The driver took off. Using a picture lineup, a witness recognized Crespin as the driver. A trunk was searched for blood evidence and the car was seized. Less than a year had passed since Bonnie was last seen in July 1999 when 2 boys were riding horses on Navajo land outside of Manuelita, New Mexico. They found the skull of a human. More bone remains were discovered nearby by tribal police of the Navajo Nation. The remains were identified as belonging to a female, but the identity of the deceased was not established by an autopsy. Once DNA testing was sufficiently advanced, the remains were transferred to the Office of Medical Investigators in New Mexico, where they would be kept in storage. Detective Kenneth Klaus of the DNA Police was assigned to Bonnie's case in October 2000 and has been contacted ever since 1998. He spoke with a New Mexico-based FBI agent about Bonnie's disappearance. The agent was aware of the 1999 discovery of female remains and thought they might belong to Bonnie. Bone marrow DNA samples were sent to Denver, where they matched previously collected samples from Bonnie. In 2013, detectives concluded that they had enough evidence to make an arrest of Crespin. The issue was that it would be challenging to bring him back to Colorado because he was temporarily residing in Mexico. Returning him to the United States took 7 years. The Mexican government turned over Crespin and several other fugitives to the United States in May of 2020. This year, preliminary hearings have taken place. According to testimony from Crespin's family, he exhibits violent inclinations. I couldn't locate any information about the trial's date, but one must think that the investigators have sufficient proof to secure a conviction.